There was a long sentence in your short story, "Where are you going? How have you been?" that gave me a good approximation of how to explain, or one instance in which literature achieves this. And for our audience who doesn't know this story, the protagonist, her name is Connie. She's alone and practically cornered by a young man who she suspects has malicious intentions for her. And let me just find where I had this quote. So you wrote, "Connie stared at him, another wave of dizziness and fear rising in her, so that for a moment he wasn't even in focus, but was just a blur standing there against his gold car, and she had the idea that he had driven up the driveway all right, but had come from nowhere before that and belonged nowhere, and that everything about him, and even about the music that was so familiar to her, was only half real." And it was this lack of punctuation, but for two commas, the ideas of dizziness and blur captured by all the conjunctions, like the long running sentence and the repetition. It's like a distillation in 50 or so words, just a concentration of a scene that in real cinematic sort of life would have countless visual, sensual, like oral inputs, so many of which would be irrelevant. But in this case, everything is there for a reason, and it all contributes to this super real sense of disorientation.
Yes, yes. Well, that's the sort of thing you can do in prose fiction if you're deeply immersed in one perspective. Like if you're writing also from the first person point of view, you can move from consciousness, a kind of objective consciousness, to something like a subjectivity, where you're moving from looking at the outside world to kind of moving inward to the person who's perceiving it. So if she's overcome by a sense of dread or apprehension or vertigo, you can mimic that with the language and with the sentence structures. And that's something that makes prose fiction sometimes akin to music, that you're doing some things that, when they're read aloud, they kind of communicate a meaning.
Mm-hmm. And I think that you also encapsulated this idea. It's more about the idea than necessarily an instance of it, in a sentence from another one of your books that I read, this one, Them. And you said, you wrote from this, well, this is a third person perspective, but you wrote, "Like all lives, Jules was long and richly tedious, vexed with prodigious details of physical existence he would have been ashamed to record were he writing his own story. His story would deal with the spirit exclusively. He thought of himself as pure spirit struggling to break free of the morass of the flesh. He thought of himself as spirit struggling with the fleshly earth, the very force of gravity and death." And I mean, there's a lot going on here, but one of the things that came out for me again is just this idea that in writing, it's a distillation, and you don't have to include the prodigious details of physical existence. You can really bring out just the salient details to capture the pure spirit struggling. And
yeah, that's so interesting. Mm-hmm. It's nice that you've discovered those excerpts, which I haven't looked at in years. I mean, obviously I wrote it, but I wouldn't be able to remember it, just sort of sit.
Yeah. It's been a long time. Well, here we come to. I'm sorry for giving you a barrage of your own writing, but here, though, I think is another thing that might lead to a more natural question about the sorts of things that we've been discussing. But also in Them, there's a very interesting device, and I was confused until the end of the book, actually. So you're a character in the book, Them, and then only in the afterword do you write that this was fictional. But one of the characters in them, Maureen, she writes a letter to a fictional version of you. And what she writes was, I used to get dizzy in your class a lot. Why did you think that book about Madame Bovary was so important? Excuse my co-host. Um, why did you think that book about Madame Bovary was so important? All those books. Why did you tell us they were more important than life? They are not more important than my life. And what I wanted to do was to echo this question that you posed to yourself. I don't know how many years ago that you wrote this book, but why are books more important than life? And I have the sense that Crane would have said the exact same thing about poetry or books.
Well, personally, I don't think that one is more important than the other. I think that books are not in. I don't think that literature is in some sort of contrast to life. It is life. Like your dreams are you, and your dreams are just as real as your conscious remarks that you're making. You look in the mirror and see a face. You're seeing it sort of in your. You're seeing that image in your brain. But it's real. It is real. So Maureen is a character in a novel, and novels are dramas. A novel is like an extended play or movie based upon conflict. Characters are in conflict with one another, and they debate one another. I don't think that Maureen is correct, and I'm inventing Maureen anyway. She's maybe a composite character, but mostly she's imagined. And the Joyce Carol Oates in the novel is certainly a fictitious character.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a formalist, and I like to experiment with the forms of fiction.
Right.
And I think of life, and maybe this is not a philosophical predilection, but I think of life as a sequence of playful problem solving. We're solving problems in essentially a playful way. Now, the forms of philosophy seem much more limited. We have the dialogues of Socrates, which are really amazingly inventive and theatrical. And just the fact that there are dialogues and rather than just essays or arguments, that's unusual. And then Nietzsche's aphorisms and maybe Spinoza's way of writing, a kind of pseudoscience or encyclopedia. Although not that many forms in philosophy, mostly the philosopher is talking in his own voice and he's setting forth an argument. But in literature, you have all kinds of forms. I mean, there are many, many forms of poetry, many, many forms of prose, different kinds of novels. I like to write in a realistic mode much of the time, but sometimes I write in a Gothic mode. Mm-hmm. So when I start writing, I choose a form and a language and a mode of fiction that seems the best suited to tell a certain story.